We're live on YouTube. Let me go ahead and start recording on my computer. Recording on computer.
I wonder when they'll do live on something like LinkedIn. Hopefully.
I know. We need to talk to Zoom's customer service.
Zoom is zooming, aren't they? Because they, man.
They cashed in big on the coronavirus. All right, we're recording. This is Male Entrepreneur, episode number 151. And we're live in 3, 2. All right, welcome back to the Male Entrepreneur, the podcast for men who win. And we've got a spicy topic lined up for this week's episode. Purdeep, how you doing today, man?
You know what? I won't take that from the racial perspective, but we're going to be talking a lot about India. And I can say this, right? Because we're allowed to say this as minorities. We might even talk a little bit about curry.
Okay, I was not saying spicy that way, but yeah, you're allowed to say spicy that way. I'm not allowed to.
Sorry, go ahead, man.
Oh, okay. What are we going to be talking about today?
Well, it's funny because my mom's here and she's staying with us for a few more weeks. She comes and stays with us for the winter or for a month or two because obviously my dad's no longer around. So it's nice to have her around for the kids. And she's making a lot of spicy food, man. And I can tell you, it's having an impact because I'm not used to that much. My wife cooks, but she doesn't cook that spicy food, and it's changing our gut system. Let's just put it that way.
Okay, we got to keep this a kid-friendly show. You wanted to talk about the difference between protests in India right now and protests in the US. And probably most of our listeners are well aware of at least one point of view on the protests going on in the United States right now. India, though, maybe not so much. So what's going on in India that's causing protests?
Mm-hmm. So before I get into that, I think the importance here of this topic is that it's all about leadership. And we're gonna narrow it down in terms of men's leadership specifically, because that's the area that I work in. I'm very, you can say, strongly opinionated on that. Nathan, you've known me for a while now, right? It's 151st one episode, so you know me. I'm all about men's leadership. And I'm very much about men having a strong role in society and communities and in the nation. And we're seeing the impact of that. So I'm not going to go down the realm of politics, because politics and leadership are two different things. And if leadership or if politics actually had better leadership, things would be a lot better. But what I'm going to be talking about here is nothing to do with really politics. It involves politics, but I want to focus in on the leadership aspect. That is the most fundamental element here. We as men are meant to be leaders. That's the whole concept of being a mindful alpha male. As an alpha male, you are a creator. You are the person that should be creating your destiny in your life. If you are not, then you are following circumstance to someone else creating your destiny. And the mindful aspect is understanding and being aware of what's actually really happening out there, taking the facts, taking the figures, not just listening to rumors and hearsay, but actually going in and understanding the true relevant facts and figures and studies of what's actually happening. So you can create your own, you can say, understanding or perception or perspective, and ultimately have a belief, but also understand that your beliefs will change and modify over time based on the facts and figures that you get, right? You cannot be so hard bent on your beliefs today and not see what's happening, because your beliefs will blind you. They will stop you from seeing the actual facts of what's happening. I learned this, and I'm going to talk a little bit, obviously, about what's happening in India, but I'm of Sikh background, ethnic background, you can say. Sikh is a faith. The word Sikh, that's how we traditionally pronounce it, the meaning is to be a learner, to be a disciple of, basically be a lifelong learner. And this is something that my grandfather ingrained in me. My grandfather was in the Indian Army for decades. And he sacrificed a lot of his best years for his country and served in a number of different wars. And he taught me the importance of men's leadership. He spoke multiple languages, including English and French, for example. And a very strong man. He had 3 stars when he left. And I have those stars here with me because they're near and dear to my heart. But he taught me how to be a man. He taught me the importance of values. He taught me what a strong man can do in not only his family, but in his community. And so what's happened in India is very interesting because a big portion of India, in terms of what happens in India, is based on agriculture. Let's just say the economic value, right? Over 60% of the population in India, of the working population, works in agriculture, which is huge, right? They grow lots of different crops like grain and sugarcane and stuff like that, wheat. And here's what ends up, what the government has done. And I'm not going to talk about why they did it, but and specifically the rules, because that's up to a government to do. But the impact of that is not very mindful. And that's really what I want to get across here is they've changed the rules, which is fair, to make the environment on the surface look more free market. So they've taken a basic minimum floor away from certain markets so that it's supposed to be more competitive for farmers. They're also trying to say that you don't need a government subsidy, which is all okay, right? That's all within the realm of the economic changes. But a lot of farmers right now are struggling because they're starving as it is. They're not making money off their agriculture, and they're selling these crops, and other people are. The middlemen are making money, for example, right? And so these farmers are going into debt to create crops for other people that are obviously benefiting. People need to feed and eat. But here's what the government has done. Ultimately, this is a fundamental challenge. They've said that if you have a dispute, so you have think of this, you have a small farmer who is barely making ends meet, can barely feed their family, who is going into a contract, for example, with a larger organization, a private corporation, to sell their product. And the private corporation either doesn't pay them or screws them over or gives them less than what was contracted. The government said, you have no legal recourse in the traditional legal system. We are going to create an arbitration system, which is okay as well, because that happens in countries like Canada and US. That's acceptable because a lot of that arbitration is well governed. There's not a huge corruption within the system. In India, it's all corruption. And so this panel or this system, guess who's going to create it? The government that's changing these roles and these rules. And so what ends up happening is now the farmers won't have any legal recourse because the arbitrators are going to be getting paid in their back pocket by all of these people who want these rules changed in the first place. That's the system. So what has happened, and this isn't a conspiracy theory. I'm not going to say that this is what is truly happening, but this is what is being told now, is that there's a major corporation in India that is the one that's funding these changes and actually pushing these changes forward, because we're talking about $1 billion family that is heavily invested in certain sectors like the oil, and they see the end of oil coming soon because of renewable energies and so forth. And they need to invest in other sectors like the agriculture sector, because everybody needs to eat. That is one thing that will never die, is the agriculture sector. And so what they are doing is they're apparently making a 20-year play to own that sector, because what ends up happening is these farmers can't pay. They will take loans from this very big corporation. And when they default on the loans, which is very likely, the corporation will take them over. And so the long story short is that we have a huge population of India who are farmers who will ultimately, if these rules get put through, which they were, here's the other part to it. They put these rules through without asking any independent party or any consultation with the farmers or representations from the farmers. They just pass this stuff through, thinking that no one's going to give a crap about it. But the farmers have protested, and they've come back and they've said, no, we're not going to allow you to do this, because This means that you're taking not only our livelihood away, but our livelihood for generations. Because in India, your land passes through the generations. That is pretty much the only thing that they have for a lot of these families. That's how they survive. And so they've stood up, and we're talking about millions of people have gone to the capital of India, New Delhi, and created peaceful protests. So I'm going to kind of pause there if you have any questions, Nathan, because I could ramble on forever. There's other areas I want to get into, but I don't know if you have any questions, because this is the first time you're hearing this as well.
Yeah. It seems like there's a lot of parallels. It seems like um, in America and Canada, I remember, especially with like the World Trade Organization, there's been protests where the working class here feel like the giant corporations are basically in bed with the government. The powerful, every time that we need new regulations, it's the powerful that get to write the regulations. They write regulations that favor their businesses. And it seems like kind of this is just a maybe a human problem that government officials tend to get in bed with the most powerful corporate people and screw over the little guy. But and I'm going to get your opinion on this. From the notes that you sent me, again, I'm not very familiar with what's going on in India, but it seems like in India there's less violence and craziness maybe around some of the protests. Because I remember growing up when I was a kid living on the West Coast back when Bill Clinton was in office, and we had the Black Bloc anarchists protesting the World Trade Organization, and it was all about smashing Starbucks windows. And then we here in America, we just had a summer of violent protests of burning cities down. And then the people, a lot of the people on the other side of the aisle that were criticizing the violence in the protests just had a protest where a bunch of them also got violent. So it seems like there's a lot of violence in our protests. And I just kind of wanted to get your thoughts on, or maybe your perspective that maybe I don't have.
Yeah, and this is ultimately what it is. If we draw the comparisons, it's about from a leadership perspective, right? And again, this requires a little bit of background. But what what has happened is a lot of these farmers are actually from the state of Punjab in India. And the state of Punjab is majority Sikh, which is our background in terms of a religion. And these are typically the people that you see with turbans and long beards. And not to confuse them with, if we take a look at, the typical terrorist profile, for example, right? Someone has a turban and people think, no, it's a complete opposite. And so the Sikh religion actually originated from persecution, because there were other religions, one in particular, but I don't want to mention it, that were forcing people of India and other areas, like at that time it was a bigger area, to convert over to theirs. And Sikhs ultimately stood up and said, no, everybody has the freedom to believe in what they need to believe in. And they were born a religion of warriors. That's who Sikhs were. They were fighters. They were warriors. If you take a look at what Sikhs wear, the traditional, they actually have a small sword here in the US and Canada because they're not allowed to carry around big swords. But in India, they actually have big swords, a lot of these guys, because that is what they do. They are warriors, but they are warriors to protect, not warriors to inflict harm on those innocent people or to do their own beneficial will. So a lot of the people that have marched on to, we're talking about walking or going on the tractors hundreds of miles to Delhi, are warriors. We're talking about Sikh warriors. These guys are men. These guys are warriors. But here's what they've chosen to do. They said, you know what? At some point in time, if the government is going to attack us, we will step up. We will fight. We will stand our ground. We will do what we need to as warriors. But first, here's what we will do. We will protest as peaceful warriors. We will sit here, and what they've done is they've camped out now. They've created now a huge campsite around Delhi. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people, because they want to show that there's a different way of protesting something without having to harm other people and be violent. And so this is the comparison of what we've seen in the Capitol in the US, for example, and other previous you can say riots and stuff like that, is people automatically go to violence. And that's not what a man in leadership does, right? That's not how we step up. So when we take a look at the differences, and this is what I'm saying, people who attack aren't strong men. We all have anger within us. It's how we deal with that anger that's the most important thing. If you can calm your anger and live through it without reacting to your first nature, that's how you get stronger as a man. That's how you get stronger as a warrior. That's actually how you make true change.
So I'm 100% with you on that. That's kind of a transformation that I had to do in my own personal life, because back in the day I was very much the let's go burn some stuff down kind of guy, and I'm not so much now. I want to get your take on this though. This was something that happened at the very beginning of, right after George Floyd passed away, and they had it was mostly peaceful protests, legitimately. But then there was this guy, I don't know if you were familiar with this, the umbrella guy, the guy that had a gas mask and an umbrella, and he got caught on camera walking around smashing windows. And that was kind of what started the rioting and stuff. Was one guy, a big crowd of emotional people, and one guy went up and smashed some windows. It ended up turning out later that he wasn't even with the Black Lives Matter. When they arrested him, he was actually part of some prison white supremacist gang, but he knew that by getting an emotional people worked up, he could go do that, and it would paint the rest of them as bad. And groupthink, a lot of people say, well, that guy's smashing stuff, I'll go smash stuff. And in both the instance at the Capitol, I think there was like 200,000 people, and maybe 200 of those people, so less than 1%, acted violent, but the whole group gets painted as violent. And same thing with the Black Lives Matter protests. A majority of the people there weren't smashing windows and burning stuff, but that's what gets the news. And so on the other side, the news over there is like, look at all these crazy protesters and rioters. I guess the two questions that I have as we wrap this up: number one, how do we control our emotions and not get wrapped up when the one crazy person starts doing stuff? How do we not kind of follow that wave of groupthink? And then the other thing is the constant problem of the one or two crazy people in a crowd being used to paint the entire crowd as crazy.
Yeah. So the first question is, in terms of from an emotional standpoint, is always to take a pause, and realize. And this is something that I use. What 3 minutes after the incident, or to challenge your reaction, if you were to actually do this, how would you look back on what you just did, and then think of yourself 3 months from now, and look back and say, if I acted like this, how would I think of myself? And 3 years from now, that gives you a good reflection, because when we look back at our lives, there's a lot of things that we've done that we'd be like, I wish I would have reacted differently. You get an argument with your wife and you're like, I wish I wouldn't have said that. I wish I would have just bit my tongue. Right. And so that's how you can actually play that out in your mind. It's just a simple exercise. Here's the other thing. This has been shown that now, if you just stop and you don't feed that emotion for 90 seconds, you can actually kill that emotion. Meaning that if you don't get any additional stimuli supporting that anger, for example, that anger will go away. The problem is that we ruminate on that anger. We get fed additional information to support that anger. And that's what ends up building it. And so cutting yourself off from that information, from that stimuli, is a very smart thing to do. You can go back and listen to it after. You can go back, but in that moment, as you see yourself building on it, that's something you have to stop yourself. Even myself, I sometimes, because I've been following this, and I follow this from the perspective of human psychology, right? And what's happening. And when I listen to the reports, because I listen to both sides, I get angry because I'm just like, this is just like, but that's my natural human self. So I have to take myself out of it and say, okay, just nothing right now. I'm just being a human being. I'm listening to my feelings, just step aside. The second aspect that you talk about, how do we understand? There's always idiots in every crowd. That's all I have to say from that standpoint. There will always be retards out there that actually cause this anarchy. And that's that's how they make themselves feel better. We can't judge an entire, book based on one page. It's just not going to work. So we just have to be aware of that. Again, whether it's the media, whether it's social media, whether it's whatever it is, we have to take a look at the bigger picture. That's why I say you have to take a look at it from different perspectives. Get all angles before you make a judgment, because you never will have all angles, right? And here's a rule of thumb that I use, and we use this from a business perspective, is get 70% of the information that you believe is readily available before you make a decision. You'll never have 100%. And you don't want to do it based on 20%. Get at least 70%. So almost 3/4 of the information that is readily available to you before you make a judgment and decision. And that will work well. That will work from your business perspective, and that will work from your personal perspective as well before you do this. I just want to end on this one note. This is somewhat relevant, is that Sikhs, for example, are very strong people. They're warriors. They defend the innocent because that's how they were developed. But in all honesty, I have to be open too, because you talked about these people that do these small little things and the entire group gets painted. And we see this. We call them the small majority, the extremists, right? In any group, they are the extremists. Just like, if we're taking a look at it, Muslims aren't bad. There's a small fraction of people within there that have a certain viewpoint that will make the entire group look bad, right? Jews aren't bad. Christians aren't bad. Sikhs aren't bad. Here's an interesting thing. The largest domestic terrorist attack that happened in Canada that killed over 300 people was committed by a small group of Sikhs.
Oh, wow.
And for me to say that hurts. It hurts because these are my people. These are people that originate from. My grandfather, very strong Sikh faith, taught me the principles of Sikh. That's not what Sikhs do. But there was a small faction that came together, and it was the bombing, I believe it was 1986 or 7 or something, of Air India. At that time, they killed 300 somewhat people. They put a bomb in a plane. They blew up in the middle of the ocean. It was planned to not blow up over the ocean. It was planned to blow up when it stopped, and the plane was supposed to be empty as a refueled, for example, but someone would have been killed anyways. The timing went off, and they killed 300 something innocent people. How could you, and it's easy to paint the entire population that way. So, I'm saying this from experience, is we have to get away from that approach, because it doesn't do anybody any good.
Yeah. I think the main takeaway is a lot of us are stimulus response. Something happens and we respond to it without thinking, and taking that time to actually investigate, do a little bit of critical thinking, take a breath and step away from a situation before we react to it, can go miles as far as getting better results. And that applies to your personal life, arguments with your wife, conflicts with your kids, or your business life, dealings that you're going to be going into, how to handle situations in the workplace. Just taking that moment to not be a stimulus response creature and actually have a little bit of time to breathe and think in between the stimulus and the response is it's very powerful, but it's also very difficult sometimes.
It is probably the most difficult thing. And I think that's why this episode is so important, because if you're out there and you're listening and you're feeling a tough time with all the other tensions that are happening right now in the political world or just in social divide, you got to separate yourself from it and keep moving forward on the direction that you are meant to go on, or you're creating for yourself. That's ultimately why we had this episode. Don't get sidetracked. Be aware of and participate in a beneficial way, but don't get sidetracked. Remember what it means to be a real leader.
Man, a powerful episode, Purdeep. Thank you. I joked with you about beforehand going on. I was like, this is going to get pulled from YouTube, and it might. But if people do want to check out the YouTube versions of the podcast, where can they go?
Yeah, check out youtubeformen.com, or you could always listen to the podcast at mailpodcast.com.
Awesome, Purdeep. Thanks again for bringing this topic and not being afraid to address it. And I know I appreciate it. I know the guys out there appreciate it. And until next time, man, we will catch you later.
Catch you later, man.